Hi, welcome back to Honor of Kings here on Kingdom in Context. I'm Sean Griffin, and I'm accompanied by my incredible co-host,
Ken Heidebrecht. Hey, Sean, how's it going, brother? Hey, brothers, how you doing? We got Michael and Chris back. They decided to come back. What do you know?
Thanks for having us.
We are joined again this week by Michael Solomon and Chris Bailey from Flat Out Insights. And gentlemen, if you'd like to, just in case they didn't see last episode, Michael, if you want to start first, just kind of introduce yourself and tell us a short summary of what you want to share about yourself, and then we'll go to Chris.
Okay, Michael Solomon here from Flat Out Insights, and I bring the scientific zetetic view to it to complement Chris's excellent apologetics. And I'm a 3D animator, illustrator by trade, and I have a ministry called CanonQuest, where we illustrate scripture. So that's who I am.
Well, thanks for joining us again, Michael.
Sure.
You were a blessing last time, so I would look forward to more discussion with you today. And Chris, tell us about you, brother.
Yeah. Well, hey guys, I'm Chris with Flat Out Insights. We've been running for going on. This is our second year that we're doing Flat Out Insights, so we're super excited about that. I think this is second episode for you, or second season for you guys. So kind of in that same boat, doing the same thing. We have a pretty awesome new channel, which is called Take on the World TV, that we just kicked off. It has some great shows. Flat Out Insights is over there. We're going to be doing some biblical health shows over there, as well as Crossing Over and Disputed Lands. And we have some new guests coming in doing some shows, Tony Stover, Ian Chadrick. So we got some great stuff with that. And again, we have our conference, takeontheworld19.com. So go there, check all that out. And yeah, that's a little bit about me. So it's all really about everybody else. So yeah.
Awesome, man. Thanks for coming back. We appreciate you. And we're glad to have you back. I thought it was a really fun discussion last time. And I think the viewers are really edified by it. So I'm excited to pick up and finish the rest of Jubilees chapter 2. Folks, if this is your first time to see Honor of Kings, as always, we want to remind you that the whole premise of the show is we're testing some of the hidden or removed books from the canon of 66. So our American Bible only has 66 books in it, but it used to have 80. And there's even other Bibles around the world that has books that were never included in the American Bible. So we want to test them, right? What are those books? What do they say? Do they line up to the American canon of 66, or do they not line up? And that's kind of our goal, our purpose, and focus here on Honor of Kings is to test them and see why. Is it a bad thing they were removed, or is it a good thing? So you get to watch us do that, and it's a lot of fun. So yeah, I think we stopped last week. We were digging into Jubilees chapter 2, and I think we stopped around verse 12 or 13. So we'll pick back up, I think, in verse 13 this week. So if this is your first time to catch us, make sure to like and subscribe. Hit the little bell for notifications so you don't miss out on any new videos we put out. As well as Ken, he has his own channel, right, Ken?
Yes, I do. It's called Hanging on His Words, right there. That can be found over on YouTube, as well as Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, if you guys go there. I don't tend to go to the latter two, but hey, we got to keep up with the times. So yeah, I can be found there, and it's a joy. It's a true pleasure to be able to put out content that has encouraged people and edified, the greater body of believers that's scattered in today's world. So I love it, and I love the fact that I get together with brothers like yourselves today, and we can just discuss things that are a huge part of our faith walks, in my opinion. So thank you guys once again for joining us.
Yeah, if you haven't checked out Ken's channel, please do so today. It's an amazing. He does great presentations, great scriptural exegesis. And as well, Chris Bailey mentioned their new channel, Take on the World TV on YouTube. So I'm going to have that link in the description of this video below. Please go there as well, subscribe, because they're getting that channel off the ground with a lot of great new shows. So, all right, guys, you all ready to dig in?
Yep. Let's do it.
Yep.
Who wants to read 13?
Go.
I can read 13.
Michael should read because he missed out last episode.
Yeah, I missed out, but I have the right version this time.
Okay.
Excellent. Excellent.
Right.
So, okay, Jubilees 13. These three kinds he created on the 5th day, and on the 6th day he created all the animals of the earth, all the cattle, and everything that moves on the earth. 14. And after all this, he created man, A man and a woman created he them, and he gave them dominion over all that is upon the earth, and in the seas, and over everything that flies, and over the beasts, and over cattle, and over everything that moves on the earth, and over the whole earth, and over all this he gave him dominion. And these 4 kinds he created on the 6th day, and there were altogether 22 kinds.
So yeah, what's actually we covered verse 11 last episode, where it talked about the great sea monsters in the depths of the waters.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't get to really expound into greater detail on what is all involved with those great sea monsters, and I think that's something interesting. I think the Father has kind of he hides things really interestingly, and those who have a desire to search out the truths that he's given to us in his word, you can find some really fascinating things. So in my opinion, this is kind of where we have the introduction of Leviathan and Behemoth, these two, ancient sea creatures that I think almost every ancient Near Eastern culture knows about, has some sort of a record of these creatures. And I believe that this is actually what it's being referred to back in verse 11, where it talks about he created great sea monsters. Now, Sean and I have talked about this on a different show, as well as I have a video on my channel called The Rise of Leviathan, where I go into great detail for about 30 minutes, just presenting a case that Leviathan and Behemoth were created as the first of his, kind of creatures, if you will, on the 5th day. And they have some really fascinating eschatological implications involved in why they were created.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And just for the viewer, just as a quick, even though we started reading 13, the very beginning of 13 says in these 3 kinds. Well, what it's talking about is one of those kinds is back in verse 11, right? Where it says on the 5th day, he created great sea monsters in the depths of the waters. So that's because I know we started reading at 13. Sorry, Ken. I just want to make sure the viewers caught up.
Yeah,
You're right. This is we did an entire show in this, man. It's amazing. It's in Baruch, it's in the Book of Enoch, obviously it's in Job, and yeah, I mean this concept of the great monsters in the depths of the waters, there, like you said, there's an eschatological reason for it. And can you guys even guess what the possible reason for him making these are? I don't know if you've studied it or not, Chris and Michael, but if you haven't studied it, can y'all guess what possible reason the word says he made these for?
I've never considered,
other than his glory, but I wouldn't know anything that is specifically.
Right.
It's wild,
especially especially as far as eschatology is concerned. No, I've never considered it.
Ken, do you want to?
Yeah. So, in short, I mean, we could talk about it for quite some time, but I'm not going to do that. But in short, these 2 great creatures were created on day 5. They were separated from each other. Leviathan went into the abysses, and Behemoth went into a place that's referred to as the 1,000 Hills. And so, what's interesting is that that's all we really get. We just get that, and then we see in the Book of Enoch and Baruch and 2nd Ezra, these other prophetic writings that contain information regarding these 2 creatures. It says that they actually come back on the day of the Lord because they need to be food for the survivors of the day of the Lord. So if you guys aren't 100% familiar with what we're referring to with survivors of the day of the Lord, when Yeshua comes with his kingdom and his angelic hosts, he ends up destroying a lot of nations on the earth that have gathered themselves to fight him. But there are some nations that have chosen not to do that. And so those that don't take part in the carnage on the day of the Lord, they actually need provisions because of everything that takes place on this great day. I mean, the whole earth is shaking, everything's falling, all the cities are crumbling, the heavens are rolled back, the stars are falling. There's a lot of chaos taking place because the Father's trying to reformat the earth essentially. So those who survive this day, apparently, the whole purpose for Leviathan and Behemoth was that once they take part on the actual destruction, which is another interesting thing, Yahweh uses them to take part of the destruction of the day of the Lord itself too, is that they end up being food for the survivors because everything is so tainted, everything is so corrupted that he's created these things from the very beginning for a latter days purpose for these survivors, apparently. And that's what these books kind of inform us, which is just wild. I mean, it seems so random, but apparently it's super important because people got to eat during that time.
Yeah, and just for the viewer, we already have done the research on these two animals, and they're both would be considered clean animals according to Leviticus 11. So, and that's the interesting part, because now he on the fifth day he created two massive beasts specifically to be clean food for survivors. Which again, like we were talking about before we actually went on air. Isaiah 2:2-5 says, when the Messiah returns, his kingdom sets on the ground, the law goes forth from Zion, which means, and it says all the nations will be no longer war. They'll be taught the wisdom, the righteousness, the law of God, the concept of how to behave in love and peace with one another. And so, of course, it would make sense that he's going to continue to abide in those consistent ways and feed people what he considers clean food. And so, here real quick in Enoch chapter 60, and Ken, if you have that Baruch passage, I think maybe you can read it after this. But,
Yeah, sure.
but here in Enoch 60, verse 7, it says, as a parallel to Jubilees here, it says, and on that day were two monsters parted, a female monster named Leviathan to dwell in the abysses of the ocean over the fountains of the waters. But the male is named Behemoth, who occupied with his breast a waste wilderness named Duodan on the east of the garden where the elect and righteous dwell, where my grandfather was taken up, the seventh from Adam, the first man whom the Lord of spirits created. And I besought the other angel that he should have showed me the might of those monsters, how they were parted on one day and cast, the one into the abysses of the sea and the other onto dry land of the wilderness. And he said to me, O son of man, herein do you seek to know what is hidden? And then again continues after that with different discourse. But this is a concept of this. Both of these specific beasts are also mentioned way before Job was written in the book of Enoch.
Yeah, that's crazy, man.
Interesting.
And
I would say right off the bat, just there's a correlation between that story and what we know what occurred with the ark, and how there was this taking of the 14 7 sets of the clean and the unclean in a large amount, to be food for that time on a devastated earth. So obviously here is this same type of provision being played out, because as we know, the ark represents so many different things, and I would believe it would represent this destruction of earth again, as we know what's to come. So wow, there's some really interesting correlation there.
So the question is, so Leviathan was water. Was a water creature and the behemoth was land?
Yeah, the implication.
Sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry, Ken. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, in Michael, in 2nd Ezra chapter 6, we're told that Behemoth was given one of the parts which had been dried up on the 3rd day to live in it. And then it actually specifically says where there are 1,000 hills. So when I first read that 1,000 hill thing, that right away linked my mind to Psalm 50 verse 10. Because that's the only time I've ever heard anything about 1,000 hills, where it says, for every beast of the forest is mine, and the cattle upon 1,000 hills. And the word cattle there, actually, when you go to the Hebrew, is behemoth. So you can put in the word behemoth there. Now, most people will be like, okay, so if Leviathan is dwelling in the abysses somewhere below the depths of the sea, okay, maybe there could be a case made for that. But where is this massive behemoth beast, right? Because the whole purpose for them being separated was Behemoth couldn't take part in the watery area that they were first created in, because apparently they're just too massive. They couldn't share that region. So Yahweh had to put him into this drier area. And so it's like, well, where's Behemoth on the earth today? If he's somewhere are the elite hiding him? Is there somewhere no one knows about? My research, this is speculation, but I think possibly just because of what Sean just read in Enoch, is that he was dwelling on the east part of Eden, or the garden rather. So I know this sounds probably wild, but I think because of what Sean and I have discussed in terms of how we believe that the Garden of Eden, which was paradise, was retracted at the flood and went up to the 3rd firmament of heaven, he might possibly be in that. I don't know.
That's possible, because my question is, if he or she, I believe, according to what you're saying, Behemoth was a she?
Behemoth was a he, actually. Yeah.
He? Okay. So then, was he on the ark? So it doesn't make sense that he was on the ark, because he doesn't fit the configuration of the animals that would be on the ark, because there were 7 clean, and then there were the male and female of each kind. So it doesn't make sense that he would be on the ark. And also the size too, because the ark was 450 feet long, but with a behemoth in there, he's going to take up a lot of space.
Oh yeah, he'd be the size of the ark, probably even bigger. So
right. So
yeah, absolutely. I'm actually trying to go to Job real quick, so because it gives us extra details. And this is what Ken and I are always talking about, context. So when we have a topic brought up, we never try to rely just on one passage for all the descriptions, since that same topic is mentioned in multiple books by multiple authors.
Mhm.
So therefore, we want to compile all the descriptions given to try to get a full fleshed out picture, of what's happening or what's going on. So like in this case, if I were to look at the descriptions of the behemoth in the book of Job, let me just run through it real quick. My computer's kind of lagging, and I'll find the verses that speak about it. Verse 15 in Job 40, behold now behemoth, which I made as well as you. He eats grass like an ox. Behold now, his strength is in his loins, and his power in the muscles of his belly. He bends his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze. His limbs are like bars of iron. He is the first of the ways of God. Let his maker bring near his sword. Surely the mountains bring him food, and all the beasts of the field play near. Under the lotus plants he lies down, in the coverts of the reeds and the marsh. The lotus plants cover him with shade. The willows of the brook surround him. So what I'm getting at is he seems amphibious because he's just chilling in the water like a rhino or something.
Okay.
So I wouldn't put it past him, depending on how big he is anyway, to have survived the flood like any other aquatic animal.
Right. Now if he were an amphibian, that would answer the question.
If that concept is true, and because I know it's a slightly different from what Ken speculated about him possibly still being in the exterior edges of the garden. So it just depends on which route we go. But just in case I want to address something real quick before we move too deep into the descriptions of the animals, because I know the viewer might be sitting here going, wait a minute, did you say that these are going to be the food for the survivors? Like, that's crazy. How many survivors are we talking about? And how big are these things that they could actually feed them? So because many people, have very practical minds, right? So thinking of details, as I do. And this is why I love Isaiah chapter 55. And if we look in Isaiah 55, this is where, when we try to take the context of these ideas and all their mentions in scripture or in the apocryphal books and try to get a well-rounded picture of what's going on with this behemoth and Leviathan. It says they were made for food for the survivors, which I think was that in Baruch or Second Ezra, that specific statement. Ken?
Oh yeah. To be honest, I
think it's in Second Ezra. But the purpose was, all of them consistently say they're made on day 5, but they're not going to be like the only thing the survivors can eat. So what I'm thinking of is there's an actual, and what we've tried to piece together is it seems to present this story narrative is that the mass destruction happens on the day of the Lord. The cities crumble. Mountains are slipping into the sea, like it's a major devastation and resurfacing of the earth. And the Messiah, there's like for my research, there's like a 7-day window essentially from the moment the first resurrection happens and he's descending with his angels to do battle at Armageddon. And then they're actually, Matthew 13, 42 through 45, the angels are burning everything with fire within the cordoned off area where the New Jerusalem is going to set down. And so they're making sure everything gets out of there and everything that remains and try to fight some, they overcome and burn with fire. The whole landscape is flattened out. And so that the base, it can be a base for the New Jerusalem to set down after it's purified. And that's about and of course, the blood mentioned in Revelation 16, that's up to the horse's bridle, has to have time to drain, right? So they got to clear out and purify and sanctify this whole area for the holy city to set down. And then once that does, that's about a 7-day window. And then the nations at that time are kind of going to be drawn up to the new city once it sets down, so they can meet their king, right? The people that didn't fight against them. So, and this is, in my opinion, where the Matthew 25 moment happens, where he actually brings all the nations before him to separate the sheep from the goats. Those who are still rebelling against him, they're the goats. The sheep who actually accept his authority and have the heart to keep his commands, they're the ones that are saved, which is why he has the conversation that he does with them. And as a result, these people in the immediate interim time, they need provisions, basic provisions, right, to sustain themselves. But the New Jerusalem itself, as we see in Ezekiel 47:12 and Isaiah 55, there's food within it that is offered to the nations. The water of life is offered to them, Ezekiel 47 and Isaiah 55. It says, come, verse 1. It says, come, verse 1. Ho, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and you who have no money, come and buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Why do you spend money on for what is not bread, and your wages for what does not satisfy? Listen carefully to me. Eat what is good. Delight yourself in abundance. And so this is just one passage of many, as I said, as we try to find a greater explanation of context of these ideas. It seems to be that these beasts are for the immediate necessity of survival food. But then after that, after they've all been collected around the massive city, the city itself feeds with water and provisions of all kind and food and meat and vegetables and the water of life literally flowing out of the city to replenish the water courses of all the world, which is what Ezekiel 47 talks about. So and then of course we see that the leaves of the trees growing along the river of life are provided for the healing of the nations. So there's medicine right there for all the people that may be war torn or, having injuries. So it's amazing, guys. This is literally, this is why the city itself is called the salvation of God. They will see the salvation of God on the day of the Lord. Literally, and they will come to it to be saved physically and spiritually. And so I just think it's an amazing story. And these two huge, massive creatures are an integral part of that story.
Shalom, brothers and sisters. This is Ken Heidebrecht here at Hanging on His Words. Because I love the Father and His only begotten Son so very much, and am extremely excited about their kingdom to come, I want to communicate their message of the gospel of the kingdom of God to you and to anyone who will listen, as every human being is a part of this extraordinary narrative. So, feel free to find me on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and, yes, the Twitters, to join in on what the Father is doing in these last days.
Yeah, Sean, I just want to quickly read a couple verses and then we'll let Michael and Chris chime in here. That just further expounds on the beasts becoming food and what that looks like. So in 2nd Baruch, chapter 29, verses 3-4, it says, "And it shall come to pass when all is accomplished, that was to come to pass in those parts, that the Messiah shall then begin to be revealed." So we know right there's the context. It's the day of the Lord when Yeshua returns. "And Behemoth shall be revealed from his place, and Leviathan shall ascend from the sea. Those two great monsters which I created on the 5th day of creation, and shall have kept until that time. And then they shall be food for all that are left." So right there, that's pretty explicit in my opinion. Then we have in 2nd Ezra 6, verse 52, it says, "And you have kept them being those two beasts, to be eaten by who you will and when you will." And so in Psalm 74, verses 13-14, in the Masoretic, I'm going to read the Masoretic real quick and then go to the Septuagint, which I think has a very fascinating extra little tidbit that I think should be considered. It says, starting with the Masoretic, "You divided the sea by your strength. You broke the head of the sea monster in the waters. You crushed the head of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the people of the wilderness." So then the Septuagint says, "You did establish the sea in your might. You did break to pieces the head of the dragon in the water. You did break to pieces the head of the dragon. You did give him for meat to the Ethiopian nations." So it even specifically gives us the nations by name, the Ethiopians, that apparently are going to be munching on this stuff, which I find really interesting. And then obviously 1st Enoch too, we have this last one, Sean, where it says, "And the angel of peace who was with me said, these two monsters are by the power of God prepared to become food, that the punishment of God may not be in vain." So there you have it. In my opinion,
and Isaiah backs that up as well. So Isaiah 27, verse 1, it says, "And in that day the Lord will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, with his fierce and great and mighty sword, even Leviathan, the twisted servant, and he will kill the dragon who lives in the sea."
Yeah.
And so this Leviathan is going to ascend from the sea in some regard. I don't know if it's going to be part of the destruction and part of the earthquake system, that's caused for all the nations. Because if this thing is massive, we're talking like Godzilla movie, right?
Right,
You know,
right.
like a kaiju, like one of those Pacific Rim movies, right?
Right.
Which I think is interesting symbolism and parallelism within those movies, you know. But yeah, apparently, you know, Yeshua and his angels are going to kill this thing because that's why it was created. So
Fascinating.
it's an interesting concept.
Well,
It is.
Well, a thought that I had really quick was, you know, one thing that Rob says a lot, you know, talking about, you know, in the book of Joshua, for example, we get the blending of the species, right? And, you know, Rob makes an interesting case in regards of things like, you know, specific dinosaurs that, you know, do evil continually, you know, that have nothing but the desire to devour, makes that case that this is what was taking place at that time. And so this is maybe a mimicking effect of these creatures that were, you know, Satan was using, like he always does, always mimics what Yahweh does. And this blending of these species was to mimic these great creatures of Leviathan and Behemoth, you know, potentially. And just, you know, throwing that out there as a thought.
Interesting thought. Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. That would make a lot of sense, because especially if they were aware of this from the writings of Enoch, then they would be trying to, you know, oh wait, we need to create something that can battle those. If the Lord's using them for His purposes, you know, which really,
You know,
it sounds silly, but in the end, it's really is all about size, right? How big is the kingdom of God? How big is the armies of the angels of the Father? You know, and can the enemy deceive enough of the world to try to overcome them with power, might, sorcery, whatever, you know? But of course, no. But that's the deceptive thought in the minds of the enemy.
You know, that's
Right.
why I've always thought that the carnivores in the in quotes dinosaur times, they just don't make sense. I mean, if you look at the Tyrannosaurus, I mean, his whole design is just weird. It doesn't make sense. And I've often thought that they're basically chimeras that the Nephilim put together for various purposes. And one of the reasons is to copy what Yahweh has done. And now you're talking about the Leviathan and the Behemoth. And yeah, it would make sense that they would want to try to create something to combat those creatures. But the whole carnivore dinosaur thing, it doesn't, the designs are just totally messed up. And so it just looks like a big biological mistake. So it makes sense.
Michael, you're saying the big, thick legs of the T-Rex and the small little...
Yeah, little
bitty
vestigial arms.
That doesn't
Yeah, it
make
makes
sense.
no sense. And that huge head. I mean, it just makes no sense whatsoever. And you see them in the movies, and they're running so gracefully. No, dude.
Yeah.
No, I mean, he's going to constantly be tipping over. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, you're right, man. So here, I like that train of thought, in fact, because as we've seen in multiple places in Scripture, the Father can use His creation, not just the physical creation of the land or the firmament or the weather patterns or the lightning or hail. You know, as we see in the battle of the 10 kings in Joshua chapter 10, I believe, or excuse me, the battle of the 5 Amorite kings in Joshua 10, He uses hail to actually overcome the enemy more than the actual swords of the Israelites, right? So He's using part of His creation, and then He's going to do it again on the day of the Lord, by the way. But He also uses the animals He's created from time to time, right? We see, obviously, Balaam's donkey is a famous story, where suddenly he is now trying to stop Balaam from going to curse Israel. But also, or excuse me, he doesn't try to stop him, but he's a part of the storyline of the narrative that's being used by the Lord to get Balaam to stop what he's doing. But if we look in Leviticus 26, we actually see a place where the Father promises that He will use the beasts of the land. If you're trying to do, I'll just read it real quick here. In verse 6 of Leviticus 26 is, I shall also grant peace in the land, so that you may lie down with no one making you tremble. I shall also eliminate harmful beasts from the land, and no sword will pass through your land. But you will chase your enemies, and they will fall by the sword. And so as we know, as He's telling them that, look, if you rebel against my covenant, the wild beasts of the land will be a problem for you. And we see that during the days of this Assyrian captivity of the northern tribes. We also see Him use hornets in Exodus as a warning to all the inhabitants of the land of Canaan to little by little drive them out of the land. So he's using insects, he's using animals, he's using, you know what I'm saying? He's using all the things of creation that he can make at his disposal. So it would make perfect sense if the enemy would try to corrupt it for its own use to battle against the Father's ways.
Yeah, we see so much of this stuff that we just discussed in Hollywood. You know what I mean? Like what you said, Sean, about using hornets or wasps to get these Canaanite, Nephilim tribes out of the land. It's like, what was the movie? Was it Jack the Giant Slayer or something, where in the movie there's this really tall giant and they put like a hornet's nest in his mouth or something like that, and he wakes up and he's freaking out, and it's just like, I don't know. To me, that's a little wink at like what the Bible has to say about these creatures and what's scaring them out. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah, I forgot about that scene. Good catch, man. Yeah, I saw that movie once, like in 2011, but yeah.
What do you guys think of, passages like in Isaiah, where we, this one's Isaiah 13:21, because obviously we're talking, same context of time here, where it says, "But wild beasts of the desert shall lie there, and their houses shall be doleful. Creatures and owls," and that's the screech owl, I believe, "shall dwell there, and the satyr shall dance there." Right? So we've got lots of mythical. We got, and I think there's another passage, Isaiah 34 is another one that refers to the satyr as well. What's your guys' takes on, because, are we referring to these great creatures again? Is this Leviathan? Is this Behemoth? Is this contrary creatures to set out to destroy? What's your guys' take on the meaning of all these things?
Ken, go ahead, man. I've never asked you about this chapter.
Oh, that's okay. What was it? Was it Isaiah 21 you were reading out of?
13.
Yeah, that was Isaiah 13:21, and then Isaiah 34:14 is the other passage. And they refer to the wild beast, the Lilith, which is the screech owl, and then we have the satyrs as well.
Yeah.
And they both say the same thing.
Very, like you said, I mean, we kind of all chuckled when you read the satyr part, because our minds go to this like Pan-like figure, right? We have this goat with the upper body of a human type thing, and it's obviously some chimeric mixing, right? Just like it was in the days of Noah. We know that this stuff's amping up like crazy in today's world, where it seems like it's just down the road where we're going to be seeing satyrs walking around type thing if it goes the way it's going. But Chris, honestly, I don't know, man. I mean, Sean, do you think the context of Isaiah 13 there is referring to?
Yeah, it seems that the context seems to start in verse 17, talking about stirring up the Medes against them. But then we go down to 19, and it talks about Babylon, the beauty of kingdoms, the glory of the Chaldeans' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. Verse 20, it will never be inhabited or lived in from generation to generation, nor will the Arab pitch his tent there. Unfortunately, we do not see that in history. So even if we looked at ancient Babylon of today, regardless of where historians claim it was literally held, there's people living everywhere in that region.
Yeah,
everywhere. And they're even trying to restore parts of, I was a huge focus of Saddam Hussein was to try to restore parts of the city and everything. And people are living there continually. And so, we don't see these type of mythical creatures just hanging out there as if it's an abandoned desert place. But if you look at what the promise to Abraham about the coming kingdom, right? What Hebrews says, that he lived in the area of the land as a sojourner, but knew that it was not the city of God that he was waiting for, as Hebrews 12 tries to explain to us. So it's destined and promised to sit down from the Euphrates to the Nile. But if you look at this concept of where Babylon was, it was on the other side of the Euphrates, which would be on the exterior promised areas of the walls of this New Jerusalem area, as far as I can tell. And to me, it just seems outside of the promised land. And so if we got mass devastation on the day of the Lord, and mass wars happening, and because this is kind of another minute detail about all the events that go on the day of the Lord, is that the nations that come collectively together at Armageddon to fight Yeshua at his return in great confusion turn on each other right as he's coming back, just like we see happening in, like the days of Gideon and other things like that. So, and this is what I believe Second Ezra chapter 13 talks about this. But yeah, it's mentioned a couple times as how the nations who come to fight him end up fighting each other as he's returning, because there's such great confusion happening. but all the rest of the world's being massively devastated. And so it would make perfect sense here if we do see an escalation in modern transhumanism science and experiments to where these creatures exist on the day of the Lord, for all these descriptions to be happening outside of the promised area between the Euphrates and the Nile. So just that's the way I've always
if you
looked at
back it up, if you back it up in Isaiah 34:14, and it says, "And thorns shall come up in her places, nettles and brambles in the fortress thereof, and it shall be a habitation of dragons and a court for owls." So, here is another aspect, because all throughout Scripture we have things like cockatrices and dragons, and here's an eschatology of stance of here are these things all over again.
Yeah.
And I think that gives credence to the return of Behemoth, the return of Leviathan. From scriptural standpoint, if these mythological creatures are here, then why not the ones that were created on day 5? They're coming back for a sole purpose as well.
Yeah.
It's funny you mention that cockatrice, because that's just a mixing of the DNA of a snake and a chicken. And that's already been experimented on in modern times.
Mm-hmm.
They're already trying to make DNA splicing between those two specific animals. In fact, I read about a DARPA project from 2011, and this is public news. This isn't like conspiracy theory, deep research. This is just public news. In 2011, DARPA tried to do an experiment where they genetically spliced the DNA of a spider with a goat.
Yeah, I remember that.
So they could get that spider silk produced in mass quantity from the goat's milk from its bladder, and then they could harvest it in mass quantities to make super strong bulletproof vests, basically. Because the tensile strength of spider silk is apparently the greatest on earth or something. So,
yeah, Chris, what's interesting what you were just reading in Isaiah 34 there, where you backed up to verse 13, where it says that, and it shall be an habitation of dragons. What stood out to me is, my mind goes to have you ever read Bell and the Dragon?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, I mean, what do we got in that book, right? We have Daniel essentially outsmarting this beast that they considered a god, right? The Babylonians considered a god, and he kills it with making this, what was it, like pitch and fat, and he rolls it up in a ball and feeds it to it, and his stomach explodes or something like that. But this was a real thing, right? This was a beast referred to as a dragon that they venerated and thought was like a god, essentially, right? Yes, you just destroyed the stone statue, Baal. Okay, we get that now. Now look at this thing that's actually alive, right? Like, this is a god, is it not? So I don't know where in ancient history, if these things existed. I believe they do. They did. I mean, and I don't know where they died off, but I can't help but think about, like, even just like Jurassic Park, where they're finding, like, embedded in these embers of whatever, like mosquitoes that were sucking the blood of whatever dinosaur, and then they take that and they start like making these dinosaurs of old, right? It wouldn't surprise me if we see dragons in the latter days, where they're doing the same thing. Somehow they have the ability to get a hold of their genetics and make these beasts come about again. Same with the satyrs, as Sean was saying. It really would not surprise me at all.
You know what? I think that transhumanism is actually going to take on a major role in what we're talking about right now, because transhumanism is the eschatology of heliocentrism. And so Satan is always trying to match up his truth or whatever with the actual truth of Yahweh. So since heliocentrism is his as part of his version of eschatology, then yeah, I could see that happening.
Mm.
And just for the viewer, by the way, we've been using the word dinosaur and dragon a little bit interchangeably. And the reason for that is because even in modern history, in the last 200-300 years, everything that we're referring to in our modern culture as a dinosaur used to be called dragons. That was the general accepted scientific name for large lizard-like beasts that we would find carcasses of or bones of. They referred to them as dragons. But then over time, as the evolutionary narrative came into play, they changed them to dinosaurs, and then started. We have George Lyell with his whole dating process in the rocks, which is, by the way, it's circular reasoning. But that's a whole nother show. But that whole process, that's where we started introducing these terms like dinosaurs because it was creating a totally different historical narrative to fit their idea of biology and evolution.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very
So
interesting.
we have ancient cultures talking about dragons all the time. You know,
Mhm.
so I think it was even Ken Hovind that was showing there was some pottery found from ancient Malaysia that's dated back like 2,000-3,000 years ago, and they've got an actual Stegosaurus on the pottery.
Yes, I saw that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So how would they have known
There's-
what a
yeah.
Stegosaurus looks like?
right.
Yeah, you know, there's so much, especially within the modern flat Earth movement, you know, that wants to deny the existence of these large creatures, based on that we know that the sciences of today, we know they're full of lies. And I'm not saying that there's not lies within this specific topic. Every single museum, they're cast, they're not real dinosaur bones that are at these places. Yes, I get all of that, but they ignore a huge amount of the history. People like Joe Taylor, a lot of these people who have actually found things like soft tissue DNA inside of these bones, and when they cut into them, it smells like rotting flesh, and like a sulfur type of smell, because these things aren't as old as they've been claimed, right? See, there's where some of the lies start to come in. We know that there is an aspect of a lie that we're being told in this area, but there's an aspect of truth that's trying to be hidden as well, because it all takes it right back to the scriptures and makes it an apologetic for the word. And so there's like a really cool YouTube documentary I saw a few years ago, and I used to play for a youth group. It's called The Forbidden History of Dinosaurs in the Bible. It's a self-made documentary, but it's done really, really well and goes through a lot of those points that Sean was talking about, and even Trey Smith has a fantastic one on the history of dinosaurs, and showing, there may be some lies here, but here's where the truth stands.
Mm-hmm.
And it's quite fascinating, and makes our word so much more viable and so much more true when we can accept it.
And Chris, what you're talking about is actually documented in various places. For one of them is the Smithsonian Magazine, just from 2016, and it's that supposedly they found soft tissue within T-Rex that they claim is 68 million years old. And it was found by Mary Schweitzer. So, and apparently, if I remember the story, Mary Schweitzer is now being persecuted by the accrediting university, because they don't want her to present it or talk about it or submit it for review, because it destroys their narrative. It destroys evolutionary narrative, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's very interesting.
Yeah, same with I forget the guy's name that found, I guess, the Albertosaurus or something like that. Relatively new discovery, where I think it must have been a couple of years back, but I guess he found like a relatively huge sample of this thing that still had flesh on it, and this guy believed the narrative of 65 million years type thing, right? And then when he discovered this and they did their testings, he said, no way, not even close. This thing is like thousands of years old, right? And so he was getting persecuted huge by his governing body, and like was shunned from speaking and putting anything out in any big, like, reputable news articles and stuff like that. So it's crazy. Like they are trying to really, support their narrative the best they can. And when real, true scientific evidence shows up, they just shun it, right? And Sean, you mentioned the Smithsonian. How many times, like, I've heard over and over that people having issues with, like, they find discoveries of things, of bones, right? They come across these burial mounds, right? And of these giant bones. Smithsonian shows up. What do? They bring it back. They're gone.
Yeah.
It's like they promote what they want, and this is where I think, Chris, a lot of the skepticism comes in regarding dinosaurs. Is like when you have these organizations like the Smithsonian, just putting out their own narrative and stifling other stuff. It's like I understand where the skepticism comes from, but Obviously, I don't think that we need to go too overboard. I think they're, like you said, I think dinosaurs did exist, just not as old as they claim and stuff like that. But yeah, it's interesting.
What you're mentioning with the Smithsonian's behavior is the Ministry of Truth from the book 1984. So they're just coming in to correct the narrative according to their paradigm, their political narrative, and what they want, and they're going to hide any information that would debunk it or go against it. So there's an actual guy, a historian from Boston. His name's Jim Vieira. He had a show, I believe, on the History Channel for a short time period. But before that, he was going around doing TED Talks. He was eventually banned from TED Talks because he said the same thing that you said, Ken, whereas he claimed that he had contacted the Smithsonian because he had found newspaper articles from like the 1860s to 1930s about them finding giants, human giant skeletons all over the United States as they were exploring the new territories, and the states were setting themselves up, and they were founding new townships and digging wells and different things for water sources, and they would find all these giant bones and everything. And every single time in these news articles, the Smithsonian would come in and exhume the findings. And then this Jim Vieira guy went to the Smithsonian and was like, hey, I've got 200 newspaper clippings, said that you guys got tons and tons of giant human skeleton bones. I'd like to see them. And they said, we don't know what you're talking about. We don't have them.
Yeah.
So you know what? That sounds like a religion to me.
Yeah.
Because if you're actually going to bring in solid evidence that destroys their age-old narrative, that and they support anyone that actually will support their view, that sounds like a religion.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Even now, as we're talking about this, do not be surprised if YouTube's algorithms has put up on the side an informational fact about dinosaurs with a link to an approved source. Since we're, because that's part of their new control campaign on YouTube to make sure that no misinformation is being given to the masses. So,
interesting times. Yeah.
So yeah, in my opinion, you've got, imagine this scene, imagine the scenario we just talked about, at the beginning of creation, that we got these great sea monsters like Behemoth and Leviathan that were made for a specific purpose on the day of the Lord. Just like we talked about and joked about last time, when the firmaments rolled open and the stars fall to the ground, people see that they're in a big room. They'll never again believe in a heliocentric model that has deceived so many millions of people across the world. They'll never, ever again have that problem. Or the availability of the deception won't even be available. And then also seeing these massive creatures, these massive creatures alone, their existence of them alone dispels the evolutionary mindset. And because apparently we didn't really get to these verses, but the Leviathan apparently has his own underground tunnel systems that he moves through. Right, which is why he's considered in the depths of the sea. The underground rivers and lakes and cavernous areas below the ocean and all that kind of stuff. So it would make perfect sense to me why you would have. I don't know. This is a little bit of speculation. I'm just throwing this out there, but have we ever wondered if we know that the ball Earth model is not what's been told to us, because that's not the description that we're given in scriptures. So what is causing earthquakes if it's not tectonic plate shiftings on a ball Earth model?
Yeah. Well, Sean, it's funny that it's funny that he brings it up, because we actually covered some of this stuff on another episode in our first season, where in the Apocalypse of Abraham, a really interesting little book, it talks about Abraham was shown the angel, and the angel's name is Jael, I believe his name is. And he tells Abraham, I am the restrainer. So he's the one that actually holds the keys to Hades that we see in Revelation, which is fascinating. But he also lets loose Leviathan. And then he ends up describing Leviathan and how he lives, as Sean was saying, in these cavernous areas in the abysses. And when it moves, it creates earthquakes. Like it shakes the world. And so it's so fascinating. There's actually something really interesting, and we can move on after this, you guys, if you want. That I watched recently. I'm not going to name the video, but in this video, this guy was interviewing on the street just random people talking about cosmology and what they believe. Do you believe in the flat Earth? Do you believe in the heliocentric model Y and stuff like that? And so this guy that he was interviewing on the street ended up being apparently Elon Musk's nephew, Jack Musk.
Wow.
And so Jack Musk told him that their family actually believes that we live on a mountain, a massive mountain, on top of the back of a Leviathan, which is like, if this is true, this is coming from, this occultic family that has insider information, regarding what exactly is going on here, right? I mean, Elon Musk's family, come on. That to me was very, very interesting, hearing that that's what they actually believe within the family. I mean, that's what they're promoting, obviously, right? It's the Big Bang, heliocentric, evolutionary, nonsense. But really, it's Leviathan is resting on top or beneath this massive mountain that is Earth. So that's interesting to me.
And that's always been the motives of the occult, right? Is they have their own information they call secret knowledge that you have to go through their approval process to earn that type of knowledge. But to the masses, they give a totally different narrative for deception. I mean, that's always been the occult's MO. It's wild. You guys want to move on?
Sure.
We'll go to verse 16, I think. Would anyone like to read 16? Chris, guest of honor here. You want to read it?
Michael? Sure. I was going to make Michael do it again. A good reading voice. And he finished all of his work on the sixth day, all that is in the heavens and on the earth, and in the seas and in the abysses, and in the light and in the darkness, and in everything. And he gave us a great sign, the Sabbath day, that we should work 6 days, but keep the Sabbath, and on the seventh day from all work. And all the angels of his presence and all the angels of sanctification, these two great classes, he hath bidden us to keep the Sabbath with him in heaven and on earth. And he said unto us, Behold, I will separate unto myself a people from among all the peoples, and they shall keep the Sabbath day, and I will sanctify them unto myself as my people, and will bless them, as I have sanctified the Sabbath day, and do sanctify it unto myself. Even so will I bless them, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God.
Amen.
Well, what I love about this is that not only is there a direct parallel with this and Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, but we have a concept here of, he adds at the very end, they will be my people and I will be their God. And this little promise is given to Abraham in Genesis 17:8. It's also repeated in Ezekiel 37 with the resurrection concepts at the day of the Lord, when his sanctuary actually comes down to dwell in our midst forever. This is the tag phrase that he seems to throw on to the covenant promises, right? Is they'll be my people and I'll be their God. And here it is, that's not mentioned in Genesis chapter 2. Verse 1 through 3, but it is tagged on right here, which we see consistently used and tagged on as he promises things to mankind with this covenant all throughout the rest of Scripture. So I think that's interesting.
And the one thing that I think people they don't understand about the Sabbath is the eschatology aspect of the Sabbath. And when you have a proper understanding of why the Sabbath and what it represents in the full grand scheme of the picture, we start looking at it like, legalistic laws, and we start seeing a beautiful picture within there. So Sean, maybe you could spend some time sharing a little bit about that, because that obviously that's such a hot bread topic right now. When should we keep it? If some people are on different days, some people are on sunrise, sundown, Friday night, all these different things. Some we don't need to keep it at all. That's for the Jews. So this topic is such a very important thing. And I'm sort of turning into the interviewer, but I think you would have some great insight on just letting that listener understand the implications from this eschatology standpoint.
Well, what I always try to remind folks, and this is what we spend a lot of time talking about on the show we do on Friday nights on my channel called Kingdom Portions, is that all of these instructions from the Creator to mankind point to the millennial reign, point to the eternity that we can spend with Him through faith and belief, right? Through this concept of what His Messiah made possible through the priesthood that is granted to Him because of the Messiah's obedience, and the open invitation to all of us to adopt these ways and practice them, because that way, we can be in the covenant with Him, and then we'll do these forever once we get to the millennial reign, as we get this new body and this new heart given to us by God. As Deuteronomy verse 30, verse 6 says, He will circumcise our heart at that moment. We no longer will have to discipline and chastise ourselves continually to circumcise our own hearts, but at the resurrection, He circumcises us in our hearts to keep all these instructions like the Sabbath faithfully and without fail. And the Sabbath itself being just a day off, don't work and don't do your own pleasure on this day and just focus on the Lord kind of concept, is exactly what will be happening in the New Jerusalem throughout the eternity, and in addition to the millennial reign. But I think it's fascinating that if from the very beginning, just like He had already made preparations for this wonderful day of the Lord, which kicks off the millennial reign, He made preparations with these two massive beasts on day 5. Well, here on day 7, right in this first week here, He's already explaining to anyone who's reading, I've made preparations for rest, and this is what we see later talking about, people entering His rest. You see that concept throughout Scripture. And because He made the world, He made creation, He knows what it takes. He knows what it takes to grow food out of the ground, or what it takes to hunt game. He knows what it takes to create clothing, or to whatever. All the little efforts in life it takes to go from one place to another, to get to a place of any semblance of comfort or pleasure, or any concept of you're finding any enjoyment in this life, or finding anything worth good or worth doing. He understands that sometimes it takes work to do that, but He's already created, and this is actually a little bit, we're not reading it in this specific passage, we see it in other places, but He's already created this whole place called paradise on day 3, which is what we're going to be taken into, which is called the New Jerusalem later, for this type of existence, where He's already made everything in a sense that we don't have to strive for it, right? We can get back to that point where Adam and Eve existed in the garden, where it was good and they were in rest, right? And so what's interesting to me, if you look at the creation week, right, you got all these things that we've been reading about in Jubilees 2 about the day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We all know that on day 6 He creates man and woman, but then day 7 is the Sabbath, and it's hallowed, right, as a sanctified day. And if we really think about this, that means Adam's first day of existence was a Sabbath. He's made on day 6. The very next day is the Sabbath. So from right out the gate, He's teaching Adam the Sabbath. And I think this is beautiful, right? Because it's, in my opinion, it's all pointing to the eternity we're going to spend with Him when He descends to the ground with His sanctuary and dwells amongst us forever. And so this is to me, this is like prophetically right out the gate. He's like, look, boom, get ready. This is, and then of course, this is a weekly concept, which is this 7-day idea. And I know there's different types of Sabbath listed out in the Scriptures, like Leviticus 23 and different concepts, where there's feast days that are called holy convocations that are also considered Sabbaths, where you don't do any work on those days. You have a feast unto the Lord, and you enjoy the idea of being in the presence of the Father. And there's there's different concepts throughout Scripture about Sabbaths and how they're kept. And I know that there's a big debate as far as people following either the sun or the moon to figure out a Sabbath. And if people have come to that conclusion that they want to keep a lunar Sabbath that happens, whenever they see a certain phase of the moon, that's fine. I would also encourage them to not forget about the weekly Sabbath, because that one's easy. You just count to 7, right? So to me, that's the pattern I see here on day 1, is that the 7th day was hallowed as a Sabbath. It doesn't say that. To me, I don't see a lot of reference to the moon on the 7th day. I just see that it's the 7th day. And so while there are additional Sabbaths of days of rest and reminders of the future that we're going to exist in his house, there is this basic one: every 7 days, take a day off, don't work, focus on the Lord. You know what I'm saying? Enjoy the rest that we're going to receive later forever. And I think that's a beautiful picture that he's given us. And if we're going to read this here in a few more verses, this idea, because this concept of the Sabbath, I mean, there's a ton of parallel references in the American Canon of 66 as far as what we're reading introduced here in Jubilees chapter 2. And it actually goes down to say a little bit later that he didn't grant the Sabbath for all nations, but only those who are of Israel. And this forces us, Chris and Michael, Ken, to define the concept of Israel. Where we get in this idea of is it just someone who's born into a specific bloodline, or is it anyone who comes in faith and obedience, who grafted into Israel? And that was the whole concept that we see introduced in Exodus 12, is that, hey, the stranger, the foreigner, can celebrate Passover as well and become grafted into Israel. They just have to, do the terms of the covenant, right? Which is the commandments. And this was always the case in ancient Israel, which is that they could celebrate Sabbaths with them as well. The outsiders, they just had to adopt the ways of Yahweh. They had to adopt the commandments. It was called being grafted in. And this is the same thing when we come to faith in Yeshua, our high priest, who is the king of Israel and the high priest of Israel. We're going to adopt his behavior, which are the ways of Yahweh. And that's how we're grafted in. It's just because we're coming in through faith and obedience. And I know the terminology of that has been muddied in the past several generations, where people look at that and go, wait a minute, Sean, are you saying it's a works-based salvation? No, you still have to believe in the Messiah to raise you on the day of the Lord into your resurrected body. You still have, but like James says, your faith is exemplified in your actions, right? We also see this in Hebrews chapter 11. Faith without works is dead, right? So this whole concept of when we come to faith in Yeshua, if I'm just to say, oh, I believe that he exists, and I believe that, Yeshua did what the Gospels claim he did, but I never augment my behavior to align with Yeshua's, then I'm not actually his disciple, right? Now, over time, we've had churches teach us to augment our behavior and to adopt our behavior after the Messiah, but they don't actually call it keeping the commandments. They just call it walking in the law of Christ or walking in love. So the terminology has been muddied from the biblical actual terminology, which is, Jesus said, John 14:15, keep the commandments. Luke chapter 10, verse 25 through 28, it said, keep these, do these, and you will live, right? Referring to the resurrection. So this whole concept is that this is just one of them that was given in the very beginning. And in fact, just recently, I had an interesting discussion with a rabbi, and he claims that there was nothing instructed in Genesis. And I was like, whoa, wait, what? He said, there's no actual Torah instructed in Genesis. It's just a history. And he actually didn't believe in the validity of the history of Genesis. He thought it was open for interpretation. He didn't think it was true history given. But I think personally, he was overlooking this concept here of the Sabbath being introduced, right? The first instruction that we should rest thereupon, right? And it's not for anybody, because if you don't, the Father doesn't make anybody keep covenant with him. If you don't want to come in with faith and obedience, he lets you not. Right? He lets you stay in your own mindset, in your own ways. He doesn't force anybody to keep Sabbath. It's a willful choice we do out of obedience to emulate the rest that we're going to receive during the millennial reign and beyond. So those are my thoughts on it.
Sean, I agree, because right here in verse 18 of Jubilees 2, where it says, talking about the angels, which is super fascinating, he has bidden us to keep the Sabbath with him in heaven and on earth. He bids them, right? He's not forcing them. Obviously, we know that the angelic beings that were created weren't made into robots where they all have to serve him, right? Hasatan, all the watchers that descended on Genesis chapter 6, they obviously didn't want to follow God's instructions, right? So we know that they have free will too, which is fascinating. But even our angelic brethren above were told and instructed and invited, rather, to keep Sabbath with Yahweh, right? Which is super, super fascinating in my opinion. And even just to piggyback on what you were saying, Sean, with regards to it needs to be through faith, right? You can't just, it's not a works-based thing. You have to have faith in the Father and his Son, and in the fact that there's something you got to believe in order to attain this, millennial Sabbath day rest.
Mm-hmm.
Hebrews 4, in my opinion, is super, super fascinating, where it talks about in verse 9, so there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. I know most people that kind of come out of the churches and start getting into the Sabbath and the feast days, they want to point to that and say, there you go, there's still this seventh-day Sabbath that we need to keep. Yes, that's very true, but I believe that the overall kind of eschatological pointing of the writer of Hebrews in this whole chapter really is referring to there still exists a Sabbath day millennial rest, because we know starting in the first couple verses of chapter 4, he's kind of bringing the reader back to when they were in the wilderness, right? They weren't mixing in this obedience with faith at all. I mean, it says in verse 2, for indeed we have a good news preached to us, just as they did back in the wilderness. But the word they heard did not profit them, because it wasn't united with faith in those who heard. So then, unfortunately, they disqualified themselves from ever entering into this Sabbath rest that's pointed to the millennial reign when we all take on the resurrection, right? They wanted to go their way of the Egyptians. They had too much Egypt in them. They didn't want to get rid of it. So it didn't profit them for anything. But the writer of Hebrews is saying that in verse 8, if Joshua had given them rest, so once we come into the land of Canaan, where they had a few years of prosperity and rest in the land, he's saying, for if Joshua had given them rest, he would not have spoken of another day after that. And then so we get verse 9. Here's the context. So there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. And in my opinion, that's what he's talking about. It's talking about this resurrection on the day of the Lord, when we get placed into the kingdom of God and we get to have 1,000 years, the seventh day of rest from our works. And that's what the Father's always wanted us to emulate and practice through this seventh day rest that we have during our week.
Which is why we go back to this calendar conversation about what year are we in? Because if this is all analogous to a day equal 1,000 years and the 7,000th year, 7,000th time period, excuse me, I'm saying this completely horribly. The millennial reign being the period of 1,000 years, which is like the seventh period of 1,000 years, right? And this is where you have this big debate on, well, what year is it? The traditional rabbinic Jewish calendar says that we're in year like 5782 or something like that. I can't remember, which would allude to be like there's another 200 years left until we hit that 7,000th year mark, right? So does that mean that we have 200? I mean, I don't know if their calendar is right, and I suspect it's not, to be honest with you, for a variety of reasons. But yeah, that's why the calendar debate, in my opinion, comes up, because if it is one-to-one relatable, right? As far as in this 1,000th year millennial reign is considered a Sabbath rest, and the seventh day was declared to be the seventh day of the week. That'd be fascinating. That would be fascinating. Yeah. That would be a great reason why the enemy would want to abscond everyone's understanding of basic times and seasons, so that we forget, that all this was prophesied from the first week of creation.
Yeah.
But then therein lies the problem, because we don't have a standard. We have a lot of theories and some pretty educated guesses, but we don't have a true standard. So I don't know how anyone can make a solid calculation.
All right. Yeah, it's a quandary. It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. In verse 20, and it says, and I have chosen the seed of Jacob from amongst all that I have seen, and I have written him down as my firstborn son, and I have sanctified him unto myself forever and ever. And I will teach them the Sabbath day, that they may keep Sabbath thereon from all work. And thus he created therein a sign in accordance with which they should keep Sabbath, which is with us on the seventh day, to eat and drink and bless him. He has created all things as he is blessed and sanctified unto himself, a peculiar people above all peoples, that they should keep Sabbath together with us. I just love that, by the way, because it's talking about the angels, right? With us.
Mm-hmm.
Because remember, this book's narrated by an angel. So, and verse 22 says, and he causes commands to ascend as a sweet savor acceptable before him all the days. Verse 23, and these were 22 heads of mankind from Adam to Jacob, and 22 kinds of work were made until the seventh day. This is blessed and holy. and the former also is blessed and holy, and this one serves with that one for sanctification and blessing. And to this, Jacob and his seed, it was granted that they should always be blessed in the holy ones of the first testimony and law, even as he had sanctified and blessed the Sabbath day on the seventh day. He created heaven and earth and everything that he created in the 6 days. And God made the seventh day holy for all its works, even for all his works. Therefore, he commanded on its behalf that whoever does any work thereon shall die, and that he who defiles it shall surely die. Now, wherefore do you command the children of Israel to observe this day, that they may keep it holy, and not do thereon any work, and not to defile it, as it is holier than all other days? Guys, put a postmark here and remind me to come back to this, because this has to do with Leviticus, by the way. So it's important I don't want to forget to explain this to the viewer. Verse 27, and whoever profanes it shall surely die, and whoever does thereon any work shall surely die eternally, that the children of Israel may observe this day throughout the generations, and not be rooted out of the land, for it is a holy day and a blessed day. And everyone who observes it and keeps Sabbath thereon from all his work will be holy and blessed throughout all days, like unto us. Declare and say to the children of Israel the law of this day, both that they should keep Sabbath thereon, and that they should not forsake it in the error of their hearts, and that it is not lawful to do any work thereon which is unseemly, to do thereon their own pleasure, and that they should not prepare thereon anything to be eaten or drunk, and that it is not lawful to draw water, or to bring in or take out thereon through their gates any burden, which they have not prepared for themselves on the 6th day at their dwellings. And they shall not bring in nor take out from house to house on that day, for that day is more holy and blessed than any Jubilee day of the Jubilees. And on this we kept Sabbath in the heavens, before it was made known to any flesh to keep Sabbath thereon on the earth. And the Creator of all things blessed it, but he did not sanctify all people and nations to keep Sabbath thereon, but Israel alone. Them alone he permitted to eat and drink, and to keep Sabbath thereon on the earth. And the Creator of all things blessed this day, which he had created for blessing and holiness, and the glory above all days. This law and testimony was given to the children of Israel as a law forever unto their generations.
Thanks for reading that, Sean. I think you wanted a little sticky note place. Where was it? Verse 26?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just simply the concept is, as we're getting, it seems a little dire, right? It seems like it's saying, if you break this, you're going to die. Well, we have to remember that they're within the provisions of the priesthood in Leviticus are for unintentional sins. Okay. And for intentional sins. I think a lot of people make a weird case that there's apparently no sacrifice for intentional sins, but that's just not true. We look at chapter 6 and 7 of Leviticus. It's all about intentional sins. But the Sabbath clearly has a little bit more focus and attention paid to it. But we do have some severe cases where people were killed for not keeping the Sabbath in the Old Testament. And people like to draw this out and say, look, how this law of God is impossible to keep, right? You cannot keep the Sabbath. We've all broken it. Everyone deserves to be stoned to death. How can you possibly suggest, right? And this is where they jump into their strange hermeneutic concept of antinomianism, right? And so, but the concept, if you understand the priesthood and everything involved, that's explained about why the priest would make atonement for different types of behavior and different transgressions of the covenant, is you see that there's something called, that's actually defined in a specific area, that's called blasphemy, is when you intentionally defile a commandment, or you intentionally go against the commandment with flagrant intent, right? So like in NBA basketball, right? You got a foul, and then you got a flagrant foul, right? A foul is when you just mess up because your limbs don't move the way you should have. Flagrant foul is when it's done with intentionality or malice. And so this whole concept about this blasphemy as a scriptural definition was attributed to someone that was doing this with intentionality, just an outright refusal of the covenant. It wasn't just because they were still practicing and were messing up, right? Which is why you had multiple stages of atonement to be made for people through the priesthood, all of it culminating on a final one-day atonement on the Day of Atonement in Leviticus 16. But this whole concept is, if a person just, and to the viewers why I say this, if you're sitting there going, oh man, I have faith and belief in Yahweh and His Son, our Messiah, Yeshua of Nazareth, and I realize that the fourth commandment is actually still applicable to my life because Jesus told me to keep the commandments, and you want to do it, but you mess up. Well, this is why Yeshua is our high priest, ministering in the sanctuary in the heavenly tabernacle, and part of the priesthood and the ordinances they were required to know and perform in the sanctuary. Some of them covered unintentional sins. Some of them covered mistakes. And this is why it's definitely all about your heart. Are you flagrantly defiling this concept? And of course, people aren't just being stoned willy-nilly all throughout the Old Testament, right? This was people that were flagrantly defiling it in a sense that they were just saying, look, they'd already did the Exodus 19 moment, or excuse me, they hadn't done the Exodus 19 moment, but they already understood the law. And this is why it's a little bit bigger conversation as far as like how long people had the law, because they had it way before Sinai. The whole point of Sinai was a renewal of the covenant, which is why he spoke everything out again, and they said everything you say we will do. It was a renewal for the new generation that was coming out of the indoctrination of Egypt from the Exodus. But they already had the law. It's actually in Exodus 18. Moses is judging from the law amongst the people. So they already had a semblance of the law. They just didn't have everything pertaining to the tabernacle and all the specific ordinances of the priesthood. So the point is, you have this concept of people freaking out, right? They're just so worried about the Sabbath idea, thinking, I can never keep it properly or whatever. And I just want to remind folks, encourage them if possible, that it's just about your heart. You want to try to, it's clearly there's the command not to work. But it took me, 2 or 3 years before I found myself 2 or 3 years of fervent prayer before I was able to come into a job position where I didn't have to work on the Sabbath. So that means for 2 years, I'm praying to the Father, help me, the Father, to come to a different job, a different way of income, so that I don't actually have to work on the Sabbath. My heart was wanting to keep the Sabbath, but I didn't know how to do it because of the practical, quote unquote, enslavement of the modern society I live in, which is analogous to Egypt. So this whole concept is rooted in work, is the big thing I want to point out to people, right? To produce income. And that's what Exodus 35 is talking about when it says not kindling a fire. If you look up the word in the Hebrew for the type of work that it's speaking of, it's speaking about a vocation, to actually not just to kindle a fire for warmth in your home, but it was about kindling a fire for a vocation. If you were a metal worker or molding clay or something like that for income. Same thing here where it's talking about, was it verse 29, where it's talking about bringing things in and out of your house, gathering water, or bringing in or taking out any burden through your gates. So if we also look in Jubilees 50, it expounds on this idea as well, but it's also in Exodus 16 has a specific context to the manna, but Exodus 35 talks about vocation of work. The whole idea was that you were to have your provisions. If you hunted game, don't hunt it on the 7th day. Make sure it's all hunted before the 6th day, or at the end of the 6th day. If you had to go walk, to the edge of town to the well, like we see, happening in the days of Jacob in Genesis, right, where the people gathered at the well, or excuse me, in the days of Isaac, right, where Isaac sent his servant out, and the servant just goes to the town well because he knew that's where the women hang out. You know what I mean? So because that's where they would go to draw water. So the idea was they didn't have running water in the house, but don't go. That's work. That's making provisions for the food you might have to make on the Sabbath day. And I've actually done an entire video breaking all these stuff down. I'll put it up here on the screen if anyone wants to go watch it. It's called "Can I Cook on the Sabbath?" And I break it down in great detail about all these verses about, yes, it's okay to cook on the Sabbath. It's supposed to be a day of enjoyment and feasting and relaxing in the Lord. But all the provisions you may use for your cooking, you might want to go ahead and gather those before the Sabbath starts, so you're not going to the store on the Sabbath, basically. Same thing with any vocation. So try to get all your physical work done that produces income before the Sabbath starts, so you can just sit back, chill, and relax and not worry about money, right? So that's kind of the idea, is that because in the kingdom, we're not going to be worrying about money, and we're not going to be using money. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's kind of my take. I just want to hopefully provide some encouragement to the viewer if this is your first time to hear this concept. I think many of the people here on this show that are hosting already have done the research and already aware of these ideas, but a lot of people that are new to this get really afraid of the Sabbath for this reason. They think that it's impossible to keep, but it's actually the opposite. It's all designed so that it's as easy as possible to keep.
Well, I think Yeshua says it, best, and we get that concept of that it was not made. The Sabbath was not made. We weren't made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for us. And when we have that mindset and that concept of, and we throw out the legalism and we just take the rest in Him, and we use that day to strengthen our families, strengthen our relationships with Him, and with our family, with our kids, and be an example to our children. I think we start to win a little bit more. People start to see the beauty in that. But when we're out there making it legalistic, and we're trying to find every nitpicking thing, and then going for loopholes when we can find loopholes. Well, I could pay with my credit card because on the weekends, the credit cards, they don't run onto the billing cycle till Monday. So technically no money's being exchanged, right? So people are jumping through all these hoops and going through all these things, let's just take rest in him and use that day. Like it says, take it back to the 10 Commandments, take it back to that passage where it says, remember that day. If you're out there fighting this, here we read in Jubilees 2, we take it back to the Genesis creation model, which is the same exact thing. And when we take it back there, this is the only verse, this is the only one of the commandments that says, remember the Sabbath. Remember it. Why? Because it was created during creation. And, and all he says is, keep the Sabbath and make it holy, right? Are we focused on making it holy, or are we focused on making it legalistic? Do we do the Sabbath because we love him, or do we do the Sabbath to be part of a club that says we keep the Sabbath? I think that's what where a lot of people are coming into today. Now we start becoming a group. People start leaving Sunday churches and coming into this concept of keeping Sabbath. And then now everybody, well, how do you do this? How do you do that? And then it becomes a group collective on what is actually keeping the Sabbath. And we forget about keeping it holy. We forget about all the other things, and we start focusing on making it legalistic and walking away from the true intention and what it truly means. Because it's, we're talking about the end result of our faith, which is reigning and presiding with him forever, in this Sabbath rest for eternity. That is our end goal of our whole entire faith. And, so many people want to fight it, that these things mean nothing and we should get away from them. But as we read, these things were created in creation, and it's amazing.
Yeah, I agree, Chris, for sure, brother. It's funny. Like I now look at Matthew 12:8, where Yeshua says that he is the Lord of the Sabbath, after he has that exchange with the Pharisees, who are kind of giving him an issue over his disciples picking grains, as you were talking about the traditions, the legalism, all that stuff. Like, that was obviously one of their Talmudic traditions, that you weren't able to actually take the heads of the grain and roll them in your hand. That was considered work in their opinion, even though that's nowhere in God's law at all. But I just love how he says in Matthew 12:8, I am the Lord of the Sabbath, right? And I know a lot of times, I used to say this too back when before the Father opened my eyes to the truth of the Sabbath, and just even with the millennial reign and all that stuff, is that when Yeshua says that, when he's declaring, I am the Lord of the Sabbath, the Lord there is the Greek word kurios, and it can be master, sir, Lord, obviously. My opinion, he's just saying, I am the king of what the Sabbath represents in the millennial reign. Like,
right.
This was supposed to be a foreshadow, you guys, and you completely messed it up with your traditions. You made it all burdensome. I am the king. You're looking right at of what's coming. That's the whole purpose of what we're doing here. So I just love how he kind of just says that. And I can just picture him in my mind kind of winking at the Pharisees, saying that, like, come on, like, I am it, right?
That's a great point, Ken, because he also tells John the Baptist's disciples that's the reason why his disciples didn't fast.
Yeah.
Was because he said they don't fast if you're with the bridegroom. Only when the bridegroom's taken from them will they fast.
That's right.
So yeah, it's the same concept. You're right, brother. That's a great point. In fact, I just want to read real quick in Revelation 22, since earlier we were talking about the concept of how everything we read about the beginning of Jubilees 2 described the creation model. And then now we've got, at the end of Jubilees 2, we've got the commandment of the Sabbath and the whole concept of how to, some instructions on how to keep the Sabbath, and how and why, if you're the angel, if the narrative of Jubilees is correct and you're an angel on Mount Sinai explaining this to Moses, why blend these two ideas together in conversation, right? So because we see the Father do this in Genesis 1 and 2. He blends the descriptions of the creation immediately with the command of the Sabbath. And I think that's fascinating. And so if I read here in Revelation 22, it says, behold, I am coming quickly. My reward is with me to render every man according to what he has done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Blessed are those who wash their robes, so that they may have the right to the tree of life and may enter by the gates into the city. Outside are the dogs and the sorcerers and the immoral persons and the murderers and the idolaters and everyone who loves and practices lying. And I, Yeshua, have sent my angel to testify you that these things for the churches. I am the root and the descendant of David, the bright morning star. And the Spirit and the bride say, come, and let the one who hears say, come, and let the one who is thirsty. Let the one who wishes to take the water of life without cost. And so here we have the creation set up in Genesis 1 and Jubilees 2, the command for rest in the Sabbath, which is the concept that we're all looking forward to as Ken so perfectly blended the reading from Hebrews 4. And here in Revelation 22, it mentions the idea of getting your provisions from within the city without cost, which means you didn't have to work for it. You didn't have to pay for it.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, you're not physically in that moment. Like, it's been prepared for you from the foundation of the world. And this is someone, blessed are those who wash their robes, is an idiomatic phrase for those who keep the commandments. And this is the concept of, at the resurrection, that, as he says, and he's coming back to recompense everyone according to what he has done. So this is the judge, the Yeshua, coming back to raise those who are in him, and those who are not in him do not get raised on the day of the Lord. And they get the right to come into the city to eat from the tree of life and have this provision without cost, without having to work. And so it's a wonderful, from start to finish in Genesis to Revelation, exactly, in my opinion, the parallel of how it's actually introduced in Jubilees 2 is we get the creation model, which is very distinct, which has all purposes from the beginning and intentionality from the beginning. And then all that has come to fruition in this concept of literally being in paradise forever with the Creator and his Son, our King and Messiah. And I love it. I love it because the two concepts are so interconnected so tightly that it's no wonder the enemy for as thousands of years has tried to get people to not understand both concepts, right? There was mass persecution in the days of Israel for people that try to keep the commandments. We see that all throughout, right? Not just from as early back as Amalek, but also just the whole concept of, we got the book of Esther, we've got the book of Daniel, we got the book of Tobit, we got all this concept of people constantly persecuting, all the book of the Maccabees, right? Antiochus Epiphanes, constantly persecuting those who keeps the Sabbath. And specifically with Antiochus Epiphanes, it was all about the Sabbath. It wasn't just the commandments in general, but he actually attacked them specifically on a Sabbath day, knowing that that's when they would be the most vulnerable. Yeah. And so, and even today, this is why Revelation 12:17 says the dragon who goes to make war against those who keep the commandments of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ. And this whole concept is that if he can get us to not understand where we live because we don't understand the descriptions of the creation anymore, then he'll easily get us to not understand what it takes to get to the promised paradise and house of God at the end of the story. And that which is that promised rest for us, which is, in my opinion, a wonderful motivator for your faith.
Yeah.
It's the ultimate motivator.
Right. So like,
well
just
said.
Yeah, to me, it's a very, once you like really take this stuff in a bird's eye view, you start to see the strategy of the enemy becomes really clear. That's why these two topics are so heavily debated.
I wanted to go back to it is Jubilees 2:9, and this was back from the last episode. So if you didn't check that one out, make sure you check that one out. And it says, and God appointed the sun to be a great sign on the earth for days and for Sabbaths and for months and for feasts and for years and for Sabbath of years and for jubilees and for all seasons of the years. And that passage is in parallel, where most people don't realize that's in parallel to our canon of Genesis. And this one is so vastly important. We get Genesis 1:14, and it says, and God said, let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. That word, as most of us know, we know that word for seasons is the Moedim. Our whole lives we've read them as spring, winter, summer, and fall. And Yet we know in Jubilees, this gives a much more clearer picture, right? And so we have to go to the Hebrew text to find that word, the Moedim, because we're not going to be taught that in major churches. Now, here's the one aspect. Wherever you fall in this, whether you're going to cling and hold to King James onlyism, and that word means seasons. The very vital aspect of if you believe in the death, burial, and resurrection is the most vital part of your faith. This is it right here. These Moedim, just like in Jubilees, these sun, moon, and star alignments are for his feast. And whose feast are you talking about? Jewish feast? No, it was Yahweh's feast. And these feasts, through the spring feast, represent the death, burial, and the resurrection, which are the most vital parts of your faith. We're talking about the gospel here. We are talking about salvation right here in Yeshua, the Messiah alone, right here in these feast days. And so many people want to battle and fight these things as that those are ceremonial. I've never heard anybody in my life ever say the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. Never.
Right.
They've only said in regards to the feast days that they are ceremonial, but what they represent in the spring feast is the death, burial, and resurrection, and in these fall feasts represent his return. We're talking about things like the firmament. We're talking about biblical cosmology. We're talking about the feast days. Not only is the adversary trying to hide God from there. I mean, just from this translation alone, if we read this translation all growing up, and it said, "And these shall be for signs and for his feast and for days and for years," if we would have read that our whole lives, we would have said, hey, maybe the feast days are important. Maybe I should look into these things. This would have changed how scholars would have read these things, would have understood these things, sought these things out. Not are they hiding God, but yet these feasts reveal his second coming, the second coming of Christ. They are hiding that he's coming back for us. And I think that is so vital and so important for us to understand. Wherever you're going to stand, in the book of Jubilees, if it was, a real book that you believe is, been inspired or it has validity, that's not even the debate right here. Right here with this book of Jubilees, which has historical credibility, whether you believe it's true or not true, as a closer source, this puts so much proof and evidence that they knew that word Moedim meant his appointed feast. Mm-hmm. And that speaks volumes, because there's so many people out here that are saying, well, when we, we're out there saying, well, here's the Moedim in Genesis, and they're all coming against us, and saying, well, that doesn't mean this and that doesn't mean that. Well, Jubilees 2 is our second witness to confirm that is exactly what it means. Whatever you believe about Jubilees, the Israel that would have wrote that book believed that and knew that word Moedim was in reference to not only the Sabbath, the feast, and the Jubilees. And if you don't know what a Jubilee is, go study that, because that's vastly important to all this as well. But I think that is so important. And on Flat Out Insights, this is a plug for our show, so this is my kind of closing, is Flat Out Insights. We're going to do a show on how the death, burial, and the resurrection and the second coming of Christ can only occur in an enclosed cosmology system. It cannot work in a heliocentric model, and we're going to go through some of those things and reveal that the redemption of mankind. So next time you look up at the sun, moon, and the stars, know that they were created in creation for your redemption. And that should give every believer goosebumps to look up and say, I should reconsider his feast days, his cosmology, because it's all right here in Scripture. And it is not only that he revealed the redemption of mankind, but he's coming back for us. and it was all part of this beautiful plan.
Yeah. Amen, Chris.
Amen.
I totally agree with everything. I mean, the enemy has to hide the second coming of Yahshua. They have to, because that is our final hope, and everything links back to that. Okay, everything that we have read in Jubilees that links up to Genesis, it all goes back to his second coming, and that great hope has to be crushed, because if people actually take that seriously, then the enemy has a hard time. They're going to have a hard time convincing people to go their negative way. So it is of vital importance that they crush everything that Jubilees 2 is talking about, and Genesis. You know what? I'm not a huge fan of Answers in Genesis, but I love the title because it makes perfect sense. Everything starts in Genesis. Everything starts with creation. And even though they get it half wrong, still that title says it all. And so if you can get the beginning of Yahweh's book wrong, then you crush the validity of the rest of it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, this is all about hiding his coming back.
Yeah, I agree for sure. I mean, Satan is very good. He's very tactful. He's, very systematic in how he goes about removing things and using his agents in the earth to completely, as you said, Michael, derail us in our understanding for Yeshua coming back, which has been heralded since the beginning, in my opinion, as you've been saying beautifully. It's the end from the beginning. Everything, there's nothing new under the sun, and this is all one cohesive message, right? That the Father is going to send his Son. He's going to come back with a kingdom, and we're going to reign and rule on the earth in a covenant of peace in the millennial Sabbath rest, right? And so if you are the devil, you don't want people knowing that amazing message at all. You're going to do anything and everything you can to completely subvert people from understanding that. So I agree. And so I'm just thankful that we have brothers like ourselves, doing the Father's work. So yeah, Chris, Michael, thank you so much for coming on. And guys, I just want to say, bless you guys with what you're doing, with your endeavors, going forward with your show and the conferences and stuff like that. You're doing an amazing work. It's just amazing. I love it. I love seeing brothers who are that passionate as you guys are to zealously put forth the truth and of the importance of the created model and the feast days and all that stuff. So we're in the end, brothers. And so I can't wait to, if we never actually meet one day in the flesh, I can't wait to meet you guys in the kingdom, and we can just discuss this kind of in retrospect, remembering that we were discussing this stuff before it shows up. So I just want to say thank you so much for coming on, guys.
You bet. I will say this, as a plant-based eater, if anybody's watched our show, Biblical Health, maybe we'll, if we don't get to meet in person, maybe we get a chance to share a Leviathan steak together. So
nice.
Well, thank you guys for all of you for being on here. If you haven't already, folks, go to go to Take on the World TV on YouTube, where you can catch Michael Solomon, Chris Bailey doing Flat Out Insights, their show. But yeah, we thank you all for joining us, because this has been another great episode of Honor of Kings. We've been testing the Book of Jubilees, chapter 2, and this fascinating stuff. And we just thank you for joining us on this journey as we try to diligently and openly test the hidden books of the Bible. And we invite you back for next week's episode. Thank you.
Thank you.